Thanks for your splendid presentations. All the hard work has been done. You can relax now. You get to listen to the energy and enthusiasm of our audience. They've been populating the chat, and I have a strict rule of first in, first out, except when I change my mind for various reasons. And if anybody carpet bombs the chat with questions, then I skip over them to spread the load amongst the audience. Other than that, we just make it up as we go along. So I'm going to call on Matthew Cameron first. You got a question for Beth about food sources? Go ahead, Matthew.
Hi, Beth. So I was just wondering if there were any species that had their food sources brought closer to them, and whether it was possible to model and predict that sort of the knock-on effects of that sort of thing on other parts of the ecosystem in 50 years' time. And that's my question.
Okay. Oh, indeed. The changes with the climate are quite something. And for some species, like Julie showed, some species are going to win, like gannets are winning. And in terms of renewables, what we've seen is some animals have started to take advantage of the structures. So we've seen things like shags and even seals resting and using the platforms as places to sit and hunt, so they don't have to, if they're not feeding anything back home in the nest or pupping, they can stay out and use those areas. So they're actually closer to their food in that way. And indeed, modeling the ecosystem is really challenging. And there's been several generations of doing this as computers have gotten better and better. And you go back to the 70s and 80s when computers first came in, and we had all these food webs, and you could model, who is eating who kind of thing. We've moved on a bit. We've realized it's even more complicated than we ever thought. So actually at this point, I would say, my team is using some Bayesian modeling to just kind of look at the last 30 years of what went up and down. And we're finding some really interesting patterns that I think are be hopeful in being able to say, yes, who's going to win, who's going to lose in different conditions. But climate change hasn't been just, straight line. We've had some cold years as well as warm years, and those are proving some really interesting, letting us understand some of the ecosystem linkages. So things will move and change, and some will win and some will lose.
Thanks for that, Beth. Colin
Thanks.
or Julie, you can jump in if you want to add it to any of that. Otherwise, we'll move on. I'm going to ask a question on behalf of Nicholas Bedding. Again, it's to Beth. Are floating offshore renewables preferable to fixed systems to the seabed for minimizing impacts on marine life?
Oh, that's a really good question. It's not clear. Static wind farms, because they change the habitat that's there, they provide hard habitat in some places that are mostly where they've gone in is sandy bottoms so far. It will change very soon. But so you actually get an increase in biodiversity because you've got animals living on this hard substrate that couldn't live there before. But indeed, like I showed, lots of changes in mixing. Floating wind farms, there's no structure there. But there's a lot of cables going on. So some of the changes there may be that there will be no fishing allowed in floating wind farms. And that might have some of the biggest effect actually is de facto protected areas. And also one of the reasons they're doing floating is so that they can unhook them and bring them in to do all the maintenance on. So far less boat time at sea. So when I talk about that maintenance issues, so potentially it's a lot cheaper, and ecologically it might be a lot better to float these things back in and do all the hard work and have all the boat time on shore. So really don't know, but floating wind we can put out really deep actually. As the technology moves on, and these huge floating lattices of 50 megawatt machines that we can put out way offshore and collect, produce hydrogen and not have cables running back and forth. So, potentially there's all kinds of things with floating that we can't do with static. So, but I'd say the jury's out on ecologically which ones are better or worse.
Okay, thank you, Beth.
One thing I would kick in there, if I could, is something we've seen, and I know there's people still studying it, so I'm not going to go into the implications too fully, but there's been a major uptick in the number of common seal issues over the last few years around East Anglia and Eastern England, to the point where the rescue centres have actually been flooded with seal pups, which is very unusual. And it does seem to correlate, and obviously at the moment it seems to correlate with the wind farm development there. And it's probably the development phase rather than the actual operations phase that's the issue. Although in the last 2 years, the Commons have actually started developing some very, very serious mouth ulcer problems, which might also suggest it's something coincidental that happens to be coming out at the same time as wind farm developments rather than anything else. But there's some interesting implications there, which more study will come out, obviously, as we move forward.
That's great, Colin. Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to Anna Kepke, and you have a question for Beth on engaging stakeholders.
Yes, hi Beth. So I just had a question, and it's kind of about improving the EIAs. Have you found that there's like a best way forward for engaging stakeholders, you know, like improving the link between implementing policies and science? Hope that question makes sense.
No, absolutely. That's a fantastic question, because absolutely that's what we've got to do. Yes, I've been involved, and hopefully soon I might have a new project also, in projects where we got a lot of stakeholders together. So getting people to what we do participatory mapping, i.e. get all the stakeholders. So we did run one for the Firth of Forth. So we had the real wind farm operators, the real fisheries characters, NGOs like RSPB, JNCC came along, we had the group there. And what we did is we got them to talk about the benefits of the area and then share with the group what their benefits were, things like well-being, but also jobs and everything else. And once people realize we're all human, we all kind of like the same things. We're all striving for a world that's sustainable for our kids and our grandkids and for animals, that we want a place that's great. Once you get people agreeing with each other on something, it becomes easier to talk about how to agree with each other on other things. So we think this way forward is really a good way forward. And then we get them to play an ecosystem game where they all have to think about the linkages between jobs and well-being and the environment. And that really kind of seals it for people. And what we saw is, indeed, it's not going to solve everything, but treating people as human, giving everybody a voice, letting people see each other's backgrounds and meanings about how they feel about places, it really does help a lot. And even though I'm sort of a hardcore scientist, I think that is definitely the way forward.
Fantastic. Thank you, Beth.
And thanks for your question, Anna. I'm going to go back to Matthew. He has a question for Julie on planning and policy.
Hello, Julie. So I was wondering how the JNCC ensured its great research was being considered in the planning and policy of protection of wildlife and development of marine ecosystems. But you sort of answered it with your conservation strategies part, but I'd love to know a little bit more about that if you've got a few things to say.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'd almost say that is, or certainly should be, a core function of JNCC, is to kind of we sit in the right position almost to kind of try and understand what's happening within the academic and research community, and then we know what the government sort of policy and kind of forward-looking plans and strategies are, but also we have to work to the existing legislation. They don't always match up perfectly, but it's our job to try and see the opportunities and make them match up a bit better, I think. So the conservation strategy should definitely help with that. So that should flag you know, if we want to achieve seabird conservation or kittiwake conservation or puffin conservation, what are the key things for those species that we would need to focus on to do that? So that can certainly help to start that conversation and kind of get it moving in the right direction and have the right conversations with government, you know, to really just focus priorities. But there's other things that we're doing as well. So I guess just sticking with the wind farm industry, for example, there's various legislation around, you know, the process of environmental impact assessment and the route to consent, and if, you know, when a consent can and cannot be granted, for example. But that does very much focus on a fairly limited set of considerations around an individual wind farm's impact on the environment in ways that are covered in this legislation. But as Beth showed really well, climate change is huge, and we shouldn't be ignoring that, you know, and wind farms, they have to be part of the solution to climate change. So we just have to, I guess, partly plan our wind farms better to minimize their impacts. But to an extent, I think we just have to accept that, you know, the bigger picture here is climate change. So one of the things JNCC is doing just now is working quite closely both with Westminster and also with Scottish Government to try and think about plan level compensatory measures that they can take. And so that would allow them to progress. So the legislation is written such that if a consent is to be given where there will be an environmental impact, the developer then has to undertake compensatory measures to compensate for the impact that they will have. But that makes much more sense, we think, at a sort of plan strategic level rather than just individual wind farm by wind farm. And there's really big things that we can do at that level. So for example, you know, if we think one of the ways that we can make seabirds more resilient to climate change would be to take away some of the other pressures on their key forage, then one of those plan level wind farm compensatory measures could be to manage fisheries in a different way that just leaves a little bit more in the sea for the seabirds, for example. So we're trying to kind of work through the legislation and work with governments to find a way to have these much more strategic and plan level compensatory measures that kind of allows a big ambitious wind farm plan to go forward, but we can compensate for their impacts in a way that helps the seabirds deal with the coming climate change wave, essentially. And the strategies will then inform those discussions and help us work out what those compensatory measures look like. I hope that's answered your question.
That seemed very comprehensive to me, Julie. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn to Adam now. He has a very technical question for all of you, so I hope you're ready for this. Go ahead, Adam.
It's horribly specific, but I saw that Julie, for example, showed some quite nice graphs of temperatures and stuff, and I just remember getting a lecture at work. One of our visiting lecturers telling us that the sea temperature in around the northwest of Scotland had risen by 0.9 degrees, and that was a few years ago. And since I did physics at A level, I realized the amount of energy required to raise the temperature of that much water by 0.9 degrees. I wondered, what is the current level, or is it even important? How much warmer is UK waters, and is that the important thing? Or is it the way that affects the differences in currents and upwelling on, general question.
Go first.
I can jump in for a second. Working with the oceanographers and predicting forward, in 2050, we'll already be 1.5 degrees warmer off Aberdeen by 2050, and 2.5 degrees in the southern North Sea, you know, near Belgium and Holland. And the problem there is you're pushing temperatures then up above in the southern North Sea, you're pushing them up above 20 degrees. And a lot of our temperate fish species don't do well over 18 degrees. They have a very sharp decline. And indeed, yes, the North Sea is a shallow body of water that's warming up much faster than the oceans. And indeed, depending on when you're comparing it to, it's already a degree warmer than, say, the 50s. Yes, absolutely.
Anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah, I can't speak to the actual temperature in that sense, but the patterns that we're seeing of animals moving around certainly has varied quite dramatically. I spent time in the mid-2000s working with Hebridean Whale and Dolphin Trust. And at that point, we were seeing a movement of minkies from the west coast to the east coast, or to the north and east coasts. And they were becoming much rarer. We're also seeing migrant species quite more regularly now. Despite the fact we're talking potentially about warmer waters, we're seeing Arctic species coming down. So there's a beluga in the Thames 2 years ago, and we've had more belugas in the round. We've obviously had walruses down every year for the past 3 or 4 years now. We're seeing more and more bearded seals as well, and hooded seals, which are normally Svalbard. And conversely, we've always had a few leatherback turtles coming up into Scottish waters. We're pretty much the northern limit for them, but we're seeing more of those. And Kogia, which is the pygmy sperm whale, which is, if you read the textbooks, limited to the tropics. Well, we've had 4 strandings I'm aware of in the past 6 years of Kogia. So there's certainly a change to the species in our waters.
Appreciate that, Colin. Thank you very much. We go back to Matthew again. He gets 3 in a row now. Got a question for Beth and Julie about seabirds. Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, after seeing that fantastic map, and wondering if the kittiwakes will naturally shift themselves to those areas where they overlap, and whether there'll be the suitable nesting opportunities and other things required for them to have viable populations out there.
Can I answer that? To start with, Beth might want to add on something. Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. I think we need to map nesting habitat as a separate thing. So what Beth's map showed is that sort of foraging habitat at sea, but that's only any use to the kittiwakes if that's within foraging range of a colony. Because they like to nest in sort of massive colonies, it's a bit of a process for them to shift in any large way. So some species will just quite happily nest, there's a few of them and it doesn't have to be linked to a massive colony, but kittiwakes really like to nest as part of a massive colony with lots of other kittiwakes. I'm sure it's linked to protection from predation and stuff. So it's, just like huge numbers together. So I think there are quite large kittiwake colonies already around northern Scotland. So I guess the question is just, is there habitat available around the existing colonies for them to expand? I think for some colonies there probably is, especially because we know that they've been declining recently. So there's that sort of spare nesting capacity almost around, overall around the UK, but that does vary. So for some colonies, they're almost at capacity in terms of nesting habitat. But others, there's definitely a lot of capacity, and that does include in the north of Scotland. So I think the short answer is there's definitely some nesting habitat available, in that kind of far northern area that they're going to move to. Yeah. I think just to link it to some of the stuff that the wind farms are doing, so I'd mentioned compensatory measures that wind farms might have to do if they're going to have an impact. And so one of the things that they have been thinking about is providing artificial nesting structures. So I think that the work that Beth's been doing can be really useful to help us kind of plan ahead around that sort of thing. So think about, is that a useful thing to do? And if so, where should they go? And it's not necessarily close to where the wind farm wants to kind of have its wind farm, but it's thinking about making that sort of artificial nesting habitat available in the areas that are going to be good for them, down the line in decades to come once everything's shifted. And so I think that's something that we need to start planning for, essentially.
And if I could just add, a model is only a model. And someone famous,
of course,
said, all models are wrong, because they're just aspects of reality. They're not reality. But also those models are based on kittiwakes only eating sand eels, and kittiwakes eat sprat, kittiwakes eat herring. So there's lots of other species that they do eat. And if you look back in time, there's been some wonderful work on the Isle of May showing big changes in which types of species they're targeting on. So you always have to take models with big grains of salt, but they're just indicative of how big changes are going to be even in 30 years. I think that's the takeaway message rather than the absolute reality on the ground.
That's great, Beth. Thank you very much. It's my turn. I'm not going to ask a question. I'm going to offer some feedback to Julie. I am a climate activist and hypersensitive to things like this. You showed a slide with lots of numbers, 300,000 versus billions. And at the foot of that slide, there was the principal reference source, a gentleman called Michael Schellenberger. He is a lobbyist for the nuclear industry. He pretends that he's interested in the environment. In fact, he always comes out with, the answer is nuclear. Now, what's the question? So just a feedback, if you ever see that name again, treat it with a huge pinch of salt. And I'm going to move on. And I get to ask a question on behalf of D.H. McMenemy to Julie, and in fact everyone else. Can you recommend any further reading regarding conservation strategies?
Yeah, I'm sure others can recommend more. So firstly, that slide, I guess the whole point of the slide that you referred to there, Jeff, was to just flag sometimes quite ridiculous media headlines, and actually that they should all be taken with a pinch of salt. I think that was the purpose of that slide, was not to take any of them at face value and think about it in a bit more seriously. So yeah, conservation strategies and reading. Yes, I mean, I could send a whole load of links. There's, I guess, a good starting point. So, and not to plug JNCC reports at all, but we've got various reports that try and assess vulnerabilities of different species to, different industries or pressures, for example. The problem that we have so far is that we've done that on a kind of sector by sector basis. So we've done some work looking at species vulnerabilities to wind farms, and then separate work looking at their vulnerability to oil pollution, and separate work looking at their vulnerability to bycatch. So what we need to do now is bring all of that together and incorporate all the different mechanisms that are coming from climate change, because that's one that's quite difficult to deal with as well. And sort of bring these all together into one big picture. But the individual bits of that, a lot of that has already been published on the JNCC website. So I don't know if that would be of interest or not.
Thank you, Julie. If you have the time and energy, you could create a set of links and forward those back to Adam. And we will publish those on our website alongside the recordings from tonight's presentations. Does anybody else have any recommendations regarding reading around conservation strategies?
Something else that might be of interest, not necessarily direct strategies, but the reports from the Scottish Marine Animal Stranding Scheme, SMAS, are essentially the compiled necropsies of all the stranded animals that have been collected. Not every animal that strands in Scotland is able to be necropsied, because sometimes they're too remote, especially over the last year, for people from Inverness to be able to get out to. But they do try and make an effort, especially for the more rare species, the northern bottlenose whales that came in around the Clyde estuary last year, for instance. And they can make some very interesting reading. They'll pull together some conclusions, certainly, especially with things like mass strandings. But they will look at trends, for instance, the number of great whales that have plastic in their stomachs. Whether that plastic has actually been directly related to the death of the animal or is incidental can actually be quite interesting. Quite a lot of them will have plastic, but it's absolutely no bearing on what's happened to the animal. For instance, those sperm whales that I talked about in the North Sea. And we're still waiting for the results of the necropsy in those northern bottlenose whales, because they managed to actually retrieve the ears from one of the animals, which is very, very difficult to do because the animal has to be dead less than 24 hours to be able to retrieve the ears properly. And they've been sent away to discover if there was any sort of damage to the animals, so whether it could have been an anthropomorphic reason for the animals to be into the sea lochs. So things like that, which can certainly help to build up a picture of what's happening to animals around the coastline, certainly marine mammals around the coastline.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Colin. For everyone else's benefit, if you could pop either something to search for in Google or a link in the chat for people to take away, that would be a big help.
I will try to. I'm going to have to do it while I'm going in the background though.
Okay.
If I can just say, Jeff, two places for Europe-wide. If people want to look at the OSPAR website, I'll send the links. They have some really good overviews of assessments of how we're doing in conserving things, and then also the Scottish Marine Scotland Science and many of others just recently put together the assessment for the marine Scottish waters, and again, that's all open access online, along with the atlases from before. So for people interested in sort of the background and all the information that's used for conservation, these are really good places to go.
Okay, Beth, thank you. We've come to our last question, and it falls to Sally to ask that regarding oil and gas transition. Go ahead, Sally.
Hello, Beth, and thank you for a very interesting presentation. I was wondering how the transition away from oil and gas with the removal of the infrastructure and the activity associated with it will affect your predictions for the future.
Well, just in terms of the movement around for decommissioning, there's a lot of work going on to see what environmental impacts might be just of the decommissioning and some mitigation issues. In terms of climate change and if we're slowing down our oil and gas intake and in use, the work I did was looking at 2050 in the worst case business as usual scenario. And actually at 2050, there isn't much difference. It's really about 2045 and after that you start to see a big difference if we really do hopefully start to really lower our emissions. So unfortunately, most of what's going to happen by 2050 is going to happen. But what happens after that is we don't keep climbing massively and increasing temperatures. We hopefully, start to asymptote out some of it. So it's fantastic that we're doing it. And there's a lot of stuff about decommissioning. And there's a lot of ecologists arguing that possibly leaving some structure in might be a better way than blasting these things out. And leaving them as de facto marine protected areas might be better as well. So the debate, again, it's out there. And actually OSPAR, again, is a good place to go and look at information on decommissioning issues.
Thank you, Beth. Julie, Colin, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't think I can add anything. Sorry.
That's okay.
That's covered it.
Beth, Colin, Julie, thank you for your splendid efforts and coping with the questions tonight. I'm going to hand back to Adam to make the closing remarks.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thanks to all of you. Actually, I didn't point out, for those who are still with us, the great debt that Aberdeen Climate Action has for these three speakers, because what I failed to tell you was we had all this lined up a year ago. And this was the Climate Cafe that was cancelled because of COVID. And it was really nice of Beth, Colin and Julie to say that they would do exactly the same talk again. So for that, we're particularly grateful. I didn't mention too much about DolphinFest. DolphinFest is a festival that celebrates the fact that we're very lucky in the northeast of Scotland and having these marvelous animals on our doorstep. And I've 23 years I've been in Aberdeen, and every time I see a dolphin, I just think, oh, how lucky, how incredibly lucky we are. And I think this cafe sort of captures that, because what all of the three speakers told us about today is the importance to us, people living on the land, of what's happening in the sea and that wildlife that is living on the sea. And of course, for a climate cafe, they got across the message about the fact that these animals are endangered, and that they're endangered largely, or at least in part, because of human activity, and climate change is a big part of it. So I think these talks, splendid as each one of them were, fitted with climate cafes very well, and they fitted with the climate cafe. I think I mean, there was one really important message I think that was got across really well: humans' impact on animals. But there are two ways. There's a direct impact and there's the climate change impact. And the climate change impact is going to be bigger. So we cannot, I guess we cannot use the fact that putting up wind turbines, for example, might have a detrimental impact on its own as a reason not to do it, because the fact is we have to stop climate change, and the impact of those things on animals will be much less than the impact if we don't stop climate change. And I think that's a really important message, and it's a fantastic one for people listening still for the Climate Cafe. The message is still out there. We have to stop climate change. It's also really nice as well, folks, because it illustrates just how important these are to humans. But you also show a really nice way, the way that people care, and the way that people, if they act together, can see solutions that mean we are actually moving in the right direction. So I thought it was really great. Now, the last thing I want to do is try and get everyone to unmute. I think everyone can unmute. So can everyone try and unmute? Yes, everyone's unmuting. I can see it happening. Right, can we give our speakers a round of applause for those fantastic talks? Greg, there's 31 of us left on the meeting. We did get up to 46, I think. I will save the chat. We'll put the chat up somewhere. The recordings will be available. If you thought your talk was terrible and you don't want us to put it up, just let us know. But I think they were great talks, so it would be great if we can let other people see those. And that's it. Thanks ever so much for coming, for speaking, for attending. Thanks to everyone. Next one is on hydrogen. I think that's going to be a cracker as well, because lots of interest in hydrogen. So thanks for Climate Cafe, everyone.